You're listening to BBC Radio Solent. Now, of course, the newspapers, the TV bulletins over the weekend and radio broadcasts have been full of memories of the First World War. And that's where we're going now. Time for another of our special reports, marking the 100th anniversary of the First World War. Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, the Royal Navy, of course, still ruled the waves, and Portland Harbour had been transformed into one of Britain's mightiest naval bases. The Torpedo was first developed there, and the very first aeroplane took off from a moving ship within these waters. But those grand defences and breakwater forts that were only half built a century earlier were now obsolete, leaving Portland vulnerable to attack, and submarine and aircraft were always champing at the bit. This is the story of the Portland Naval Base in the First World War.
Anglo-German relations had been deteriorating since the turn of the 20th century. Under the first Sea Lord, Sir John Fisher, ship design was revolutionised. Gunfire range increased from 3,000 to 10,000 yards, and in 1906 the powerful Dreadnought was launched. With its 10 12-inch guns, a displacement of 18,000 tons, and a speed of 21 knots, there was nothing at sea to match it. The megalomaniac Kaiser Wilhelm II was furious, and the Germans responded by ratcheting up their ship design and construction to unprecedented levels. The outcome of this naval arms race quickly became apparent when war was declared on August the 4th, 1914. A month earlier, the 460 ships of the home fleets gathered at Portland. Churchill later recollected, it constituted incomparably the greatest assemblage of naval power ever assembled in the history of the world.
That's local historian Stuart Morris reading an extract from his book, Dorset, the Royal Navy. The book goes right back to the origins of the long-running naval presence in Portland, but here Stuart looks at the role the harbour and its surrounding area played during the First World War, beginning with its readiness for war in 1914.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Nice weather for the war. That's the British one.
Britain had probably the strongest navy in the world on the run-up to the Great War. I mean, there'd been a huge arms race, particularly with Germany, once Sir Kaiser and Britain started getting in opposition with each other and realising that they were taking opposing sides. All the naval forces, the naval armoury was upgraded at a phenomenal rate. So it really was an arms race, bar none. We had more submarines at the outbreak of the Great War than any other nation. That rapidly changed, obviously, once the war started.
Sing a song of Rule Britannia, now there's fighting work to do. Ever staunch and ready when the hour is nigh, British boys know how to fight and how to die.
The key thing is the Portland Harbour, which had only just been finally completed. I say completed, it was started in 1848. The first two breakwaters to sort of semi-enclose the harbour were completed in 1872, but the advent of the torpedo and looming submarines meant that they had to enclose the rest of the harbour, and that was completed in about 1905 by two further breakwater arms linking right up to the Weymouth side, leaving entrances obviously for the passage of ships in and out. But effectively that formed at the time the largest man-made harbour in the world. It became a very important base for naval shippings. It was never a rival to Plymouth in terms of the number of ships that were permanently based here, but a lot of naval squadrons were centred here and based here, and it was a major harbour of refuge in this part of the channel.
Boys in khaki, boys in blue, here's the best of jolly good luck to you. You're all right in love or war. You can never again just the same as you've done before. Boys in khaki, boys in blue, it's no idle boast or brag. When we get you both together, there's going to be thirsty weather for anyone who's trampled on the flag.
Portland as a naval base, it certainly did have advantages, and it still has. It had a very low tidal range, less than 2 metres normally, The harbour itself, the harbour bed, was unencumbered by rocks, and it was very smooth bottom, yet it was deep enough for the largest naval ships. It had a huge area of deep water, but probably one of the best advantages of the lot was that access to the open sea and the English Channel was almost immediate. As soon as you got out of the shelter of the breakwater arms and out of the lee of Portland, you were in the Channel. You take the Solent and the Plymouth, for instance, it takes an age even today for naval shipping to get out into the open water. They've got to go at very low speed. That was never a problem here at Portland. So there were and are major advantages.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Oh, we rock with eggs and ham when we got plum and apple jam. Come fast, Richard, how can we spend the money we earn? Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Portland was very vulnerable. With U-boats in the Channel, it became a very, very serious threat to all shipping. Yet the biggest threat was thought to be in the North Sea, and that's where the greatest concentration of warships were. So it was a twofold thing. One, to remove the vulnerable Grand Fleet from the Portland area. So he sent them off to the North Sea, which left Portland with only the secondary fleets stationed here. And of course the harbour itself then became a centre of anti-U-boat activities, with a lot of converted trawlers, half-inch, to sort of borrowed by the Navy to be converted. They would arm these trawlers and they would patrol the waters outside of Portland and Weymouth against U-boats. But for most of the war, the big fleets were not able to be stationed here for very obvious reasons. It was in the early hours of January the 1st, 1915. The Formidable was in the Channel, just off Portland. The sea state was getting very, very rough. That was enough to exercise the manoeuvrability of the ship, but what they didn't realise is there was a marauding U-boat in the Channel. It spotted the Formidable and fired a torpedo. By then it was extremely rough. The first one hit home, caused a major list on the ship, but they thought it was recoverable, no immediate danger of it sinking. But then a short while later, the U-boat fired another torpedo, which caused it to gradually sink. It was a very heavy loss of life. Over 500 sailors drowned on that one. There were some who were rescued, but it was the rough sea which increased the toll of casualties on that one. But it really did drive home the threat and the danger that U-boats posed to anything in the English Channel. Mines were a really serious problem. Along with the torpedoes, the mines were just as bad, and mine detection also became a very important issue. Because of that, a lot of minesweepers were deployed in this area. The idea they had was to create shipping lanes which were patrolled and swept, hopefully clear of mines. They couldn't hope to cover the whole sea area off of the Dorset coast, but they designated shipping lanes which they concentrated on to get access to and from the ports and along the Channel, reasonably clear of mines. Having said that, there were very, very many casualties. Whatever ship came in proximity to a mine, that was it. There was no escape. Well, the trawlers were used for patrol duties and for minesweeping. They were seaworthy craft, and they were deployed by the Admiralty, taken over from civilian hands, of course, and converted. They fulfilled a very important function in helping to keep the area clear. The Admiralty realised they had to do something drastic about this, and how to detect U-boats and submarines was a major task. Early thoughts about how to capture U-boats or detect them were pretty farcical and pretty basic and often mechanical. When they realised that they had to employ scientific methods, that really concentrated minds, and a major establishment was set up based on Portland, actually, which became the Anti-submarine Detection Unit. And they did develop the concept of using sound waves to reflect off of U-boats in the water, and various devices were invented. Obviously it manifested itself as sonar, ASDIC as it was called initially. That became so successful in detecting submarines. Obviously once you can detect them, you'd drop your mines, and hopefully that was it. Once that had become somewhat refined, the number of attacks by U-boats absolutely plummeted in the English Channel, and they were able to develop this, and it was a continuing scientific endeavour, and it became centred on Portland, as I say. It was initially called HMS Sarepta, a shore-based establishment for research. Later on, in the early 20s, it became HMS Osprey, to Portland in various contexts ever since. Well, obviously there was Robert Whitehead, who virtually invented the torpedo, and sort of 30 years before that he set up this factory at White Regis in the 1890s, and it was a big factory and employed a lot of people to build and develop the torpedoes. It was an ongoing development because they constantly were refining the design of them, and by 1914 I think they were developing what was called a hot air torpedo. Most of them worked with a system of compressed air. Although they churned out thousands upon thousands of them, each one was incredibly expensive. I did a calculation that each one would have cost £60,000 or £70,000 in today's money. There was a halt on the Weymouth to Portland line. Of course, all the materials had to come in, and they would take them out by train and by sea. There was a long jetty leading out from the torpedo works where they used to take the torpedoes out for testing purposes, and they would fire them. There were also, on the breakwaters themselves, there were testing stations where they would launch torpedoes. Obviously, by the nature of its testings, not everything worked as it should, and there are quite a number of incidents where stray torpedoes were careering around the harbour, both inside and out, and then they did hit several vessels when they were out of control. They all had dummy warheads when they were doing the testing, fortunately, otherwise that really would have been catastrophic. I don't think there are many casualties, but rather embarrassing all round, but that's the nature of testing.
Are we down hearted? No! Then let your voices ring and all together sing. Are we down hearted? No! Not while Britannia rules the waves, not likely. While we have Jack upon the sea and Tom beyond the land, we need not fret. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but we're not downhearted yet.
These Q-boats were devious but a very clever way of fooling the enemy. They obviously were confronted with a naval vessel, well armed with all the guns bristling off. The U-boats would be far more cautious, particularly when they surfaced to attack, or if they did surface. The Admiralty had the idea of disguising naval vessels, making them look like merchant ships, would have been unarmed in the German eyes. So they had ships converted with all the guns camouflaged or hidden behind screens, and it made them look exactly like a merchant ship would do. The idea of that, of course, was the U-boat commanders would be less cautious and probably approach them thinking they had an easy target there, and they did fire indiscriminately at anything on the water. If it wasn't their own vessels, they would just shoot and sink. It was a very, very callous policy to sink civilian ships like that and merchant ships, but that's what they did. Of course, these Q ships could then uncover their guns and return the fire, hopefully, and take the U-boats by surprise, and they were very effective.
The boats of the red, white and blue, the boats of the red, white and blue, with her flag floating proudly before her. The boats of the red, white and blue.
If the fleets came in, they all wanted to have shore leave. When the big battleships came ashore, I mean, you're talking of several thousand men. They did all head for Weymouth. Obviously, the nightlife there, I suppose, was a bit more energetic than Portland. There were naval patrols, obviously, to try and keep them in order, but Portland had, at the time, more pubs per head of population than probably anywhere else in England, and it was almost entirely due to the naval presence, so they did come to Portland as well as Weymouth. But Weymouth, for the nightlife and the day life and the general rapport with the local girls, was the place to go. And the Navy ships, they organised all sorts of things ashore, and a lot of concert parties and fancy dress parades and things like this. They certainly took part in the local high life of the area, and it had a big impact. Obviously, it helped the economy of the place. All the hotels and the pubs, the clubs that existed at the time, and the shops all did pretty well out of the Navy boys once they went ashore. This is another way in which the presence of the Royal Navy in Dorset had a pretty big impact on the way it developed over the years.
All the nice girls and all the sailors, all the nice girls and all the songs, all the sing about the sailor, when you know what sailors are.
The story of the Portland Naval Base in the First World War.